I don't have any. I don't have
that.
any preloaded puns, but if any come to me,
Okay.
I didn't know this was a challenge.
I was about to say suddenly it's a dare.
Who brought in the snacks? Oh, it's already recording.
So Dan, I'm gonna take notes on like questions or just anything like. I'm not taking notes on our presentation.
you give me notes later.
Oh, I meant like, I'm not writing down what we say. but we don't-
You problem solve, Brad. Made a bunch of comments.
Yeah.
That's not gonna be
Is
on
there
the
anything
video.
else that you are waiting for? Well, I think just Brad.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, there he is.
He was probably riding his bike on the way here.
Do you want any admin folks up here? Do you want Brad up here? Yeah, we want Brad.
And Emily, yeah.
Emily.
All right, Brad and Emily, you've been requested to join us at the table.
We do have Diana Woods. I don't know if we will. Diana, I don't know, you're welcome to come up, you don't have to if you want to speak, or it's up to you. Or you can comment later.
It reminds me.
Yeah, wherever you want.
of Seattle Airport singing fountain.
Oh, yeah. Didn't they take that out or?
I don't know. I love that thing.
Yeah. By the back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You try to fill your water bottle and everybody's looking.
Yeah, totally.
Hey, it's here. For being here. Yeah. They're just here.
Like other admin folks do.
Oh, sure, I mean, whatever.
Or we can swap it.
I mean, they're not part of that. That's right. Great, I'm gonna get started.
All right, is the recording on? Wonderful. All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order. This is a work session, excuse me, on AO 2023-65, Infrastructure for Bicycles. We are noticed today from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Let's go ahead and start with a round of introductions.
George Martinez.
Daniel Voland.
Kevin Cross.
Karen Bronga.
Anna Brawley.
Felix Rivera, and then on the phone we have Mr. Salt.
Randy Holton here, thank you.
Wonderful. And then if we could have our presenters here introduce themselves.
Emily Weiser with Bike Anchorage.
Diana Rhodes, Anchorage Park Foundation.
Brad Coy, Municipal Traffic Engineer.
Wonderful. All right. And then we're also joined by Assembly Council staff, clerk's office staff, and then by some administration staff as well. I'll go ahead and turn it over to the presenters.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Member Rivera, for agreeing to chair this. I really appreciate it. So members will see in front of them that they have ordinance 2023-65, and then also an S version. And so this legislation, the result of a lot of collaboration, and the reason that we have our presenters at the table here today is because they both Brad Coy, our municipal traffic director, and Emily Weiser from Bike Anchorage and a couple other Bike Anchorage folks were really instrumental in helping us improve this legislation and draft some of the language as well. So we have a presentation up here on the PowerPoint here. The title is Breaking the Cycle. Co-sponsors are myself, Member Brawley, and Member Bronga. And we'll go to the next slide.
Just want to note really quick, we've been joined by Mr. Johnson. Thanks.
So This slide I think is really interesting. Change in road deaths during the pandemic, deaths in 2020 compared with the 2017 to 19 average. And I guess this data is just the opposite of what I would have expected, when we were all hunkering down and maybe there weren't as many folks out on the road, that road deaths would have gone down. But you can see, particularly in the United States, that we have a concerning trend there. Next slide. And we also have a concerning trend in Anchorage, and we've all seen many headlines like the following. Yeah, maybe hit forward again there, Jamie. So these are all local headlines about pedestrians and bicyclists either being injured or killed.
And
Thanks.
this
Go
is,
ahead.
Anna, if I can just add, this doesn't even include the one that happened on July 1st on Minnesota Boulevard. So just to say this is an ongoing issue, as I think we know.
Yeah, and I'll pause at the end of each slide for my co-sponsors to chime in too. Great. Okay, next slide. So there's some national data that is, it demonstrates that race and ethnicity do play a role in pedestrian deaths. And this is dangerous by design. I think a big correlation there is the infrastructure investments in communities of color or lower income neighborhoods. And we have some disturbing data. On average, 19 people die on Anchorage streets every year. 43% of these deaths are people walking or riding a bike. For every person killed, 150 are seriously injured. A 2022 report found that those who die are disproportionately people of color. Indigenous people are killed at the highest rates of all measured ethnicities. Some additional notes based on the Municipality of Anchorage Traffic Department's 2021 Annual Traffic Report publication. In 2021, there were 3,430 crashes within the municipality, and for every 37 crashes, one involved a pedestrian. Also, of those 3,430 crashes, 1,205 resulted in an injury or fatality. Pedestrian-involved collisions have a higher proportional rate of injuries and fatalities. In 2021, there were 92 total collisions involving pedestrians. Of those 92 crash incidents, 83 resulted in an injury or fatality. Concerningly, the crash analysis 3 and 5 year moving average data demonstrate that when compared to national averages, pedestrian injury and bicyclist injury rates in the municipality of Anchorage are approximately double those national averages. So the data make it clear that Anchorage has a long way to go when it comes to making our infrastructure safer for non-motorized users, or vulnerable road users, as this ordinance calls them. We'll talk about that term in a bit. Another key point as we frame this conversation, even though they are a given part of modern life, cars are inherently dangerous. We know that drivers kill people. But have you ever heard of someone dying after being hit by a bike? Okay, there may be odd stories out there, but it's likely much less commonplace for someone to be seriously injured or killed when run into by a bike. So as we consider the future of transportation in Anchorage and how we prioritize investments that may help create a transportation mode shift, we should be cognizant that creating opportunities for active transportation actually has the potential to make everyone safer. The more car trips that can be substituted by walking or bike trips, the lesser the risk of killing a pedestrian at any given time. Next slide. Anything you wanted to add, Anna or Karen? Great. So here's the goals of the ordinance. Number one, avoid pedestrian deaths. We want to do something about the rising local rates of pedestrian deaths, and we hope that some of the things that are outlined in this ordinance will push us in that direction. Number two, we want to reduce over-policing of non-motorized travel and free up our limited police sources to fight real crime. And then third, mitigate future vehicle congestion. With increasing density, we want to help create affordable communities with less traffic congestion and pollution. Next slide. So here's kind of the first overarching theme here is safe, equitable, healthy communities. How do we build those? Next slide. Some key components here is that we define key terms in code and messaging. We legalize some bike-friendly behavior, some behaviors that bicyclists are already doing that is maybe considered not currently legal. We establish tools for municipal projects, and we remove fines for certain equipment regulations. Next slide. So this is not something that is explicitly defined in our ordinance, but active transportation, I want to talk about this. This is sort of the new catchphrase for non-motorized travel. It's a nationally recognized term. Basically, it talks about modes of transportation, bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure that get people moving. And it's a way to think about your daily commute, your weekly errands, or visits around town. Infrastructure that supports active transportation helps reduce obesity and the risk for developing costly chronic conditions such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So as a healthcare provider myself, active transportation is a public health issue. The Anchorage Assembly, Anchorage Health Department, and the Anchorage Parks and Rec Department jointly affirmed our commitment to fostering active transportation in Assembly Resolution 2023-2025, a resolution supporting the Active People Healthy Nation initiative. One of the strategies that we resolved to implement was active friendly routes to everyday destinations. That's an effort to make it safe and easy to walk, bicycle, or wheelchair roll for people of all ages and abilities by improving the design of routes such as sidewalks, trails, bicycle lanes, and public transit to destinations such as grocery stores, schools, work sites, libraries, parks, or healthcare facilities. Active transportation facilities are particularly important in low-income and minority communities or communities that have high percentages of new immigrants, because people in those communities are less likely to own vehicles. And unsafe streets might pose a barrier to using active transportation. Another way that I want to frame active transportation as a priority for the municipality of Anchorage is transportation choice. Folks should have the choice of how they want to get around town, whether that's a vehicle, personal vehicle, or if it's public transit, or if they're riding their bike or walking or rolling in their wheelchair, they should be able to do any of those transportation options safely. Next slide. So here's the first of our definitions in the ordinance: vulnerable road user. Kind of a weird term, but it is something that, again, is nationally recognized. USDOT is using this term. And in fact, as you can see on the slide here, this ordinance codifies vulnerable road user. That's a recommendation of the Anchorage Vision Zero plan, that we would come up with a vulnerable road user law in Anchorage. So who are our vulnerable road users? Well, it's a person on a public roadway who's not using a motor vehicle. So that can be people walking and rolling on a road, people working or along a public road, like a flagger, for instance, people walking or riding an animal, so somebody walking their dog or riding a horse. Randy, you're on the phone. You might have some horseback riders down there in South Anchorage, right? People legally riding bicycles, skateboards, roller skates, or low-speed electric devices like e-bikes, scooters, and by scooters, we don't mean a Vespa, we mean like an e-kick scooter, right? A bird scooter, for instance, and motorized wheelchairs. Next slide. So here's the first of our bike-friendly behaviors that this ordinance legalizes. It's called the Idaho Stop. This allows people essentially to treat a stop sign at an intersection as a yield, people who are vulnerable road users. So they don't have to come to a complete stop if the intersection is safe to pass through, meaning there's no oncoming. They've identified that there's no oncoming perpendicular traffic. In 1982, Idaho legalized the Idaho Stop to help relieve its caseload. In 2017, Delaware became the second state to adopt the practice. And now, as of 2023, a total of 9 states have authorized the Idaho Stop. It's a very popular piece of bike legislation. Idaho essentially concluded that mandating every bike should come to a full stop at every stop sign was not important enough to issue a citation. And they were right. Stop signs are great for preventing car crashes at minor intersections, but bicyclists don't cause major crashes. And stop signs at intersections are only a place that they become more vulnerable. The longer a non-motorized user hangs out at an intersection, that's not a safe environment for them, the more likely there is to be an incident. So an important aspect of this is that aside from bike safety and empowerment, Also, a consideration is equity. Ticky-tacky bike laws like bike stopping at stop signs get disproportionately enforced on a national level. We're not talking specific to Anchorage, but they get disproportionately enforced on a national level against people of color. And NACTO, which is a National Association of City Transportation Officials, they have a fantastic report that informed this legislation called Breaking the Cycle. And it documents these issues, and several insights are reflected in our whereas statements. The next slide is a fun little animation about the Idaho stop.
Bikes for all kinds of reasons: exercise, fun, and of course, getting from point A to point B efficiently. That's where Oregon's new stop is your law comes in. It allows a person riding a bike to keep some momentum at an intersection while checking for oncoming traffic. Just like it sounds, you're treating that stop as a unit. While all the rules of right of way still apply, this rolling stop helps make the ride more efficient and improves the flow of traffic. The law is new, but one thing still remains constant: we all need to look out for each other. It's how Oregonians stand out.
So as you can see, Oregon implemented their version of the Idaho stop. It's interesting too, as an eye doctor working on this, one of the things that I came across when I was researching is that bikes in motion tends to catch people's peripheral vision. And I won't get too nerdy about this, but we all have our cones in our macula, which is our central vision, right? That's where our clear acuity and our color perception comes from. But then elsewhere in our peripheral acuity, we have more rods, and rod cells are more sensitive to motion, which is why if you see something moving in your periphery, it kind of catches your attention. So I think that's interesting. Next slide. So we're calling our version the Anchorage stop. And why are we special? Well, we extend the Idaho stop to any vulnerable road user. So that would be people who are legally in the roadway. So that could be people using wheelchairs, riding bicycles or skateboards, roller skates, or using low-speed electric devices. So again, if you're on that motor, or that not motorized, but electric scooter, like an e-kick scooter, you could also slow instead of coming to a full stop. Or if you're on a one wheel, for instance, which are really gaining popularity. Next slide. Here is the second bike-friendly behavior that this ordinance legalizes. It's called dead red. And what this does is it allows people on bikes to proceed through a red light after 2 minutes. Our version says 2 minutes. Essentially, this is treating a red light more like a stop sign. One problematic thing is that sometimes signals don't detect people on bikes in the way that they would also detect a car. So a bicyclist is just sitting at the intersection waiting for a light that's not recognizing them to turn, and it never does. And so already a lot of cyclists will just proceed through the intersection when it's safe to do so. And again, there's no perpendicular traffic oncoming. Another big thing is we have a lot of winter bikers. Yes, people in Anchorage do bike in the winter. We've all seen the fat bikers, and that's gaining popularity too. Sometimes they can't, it's not feasible for them to like get in the lane and reach the traffic signal button, especially if you got a huge snow berm that's preventing you from doing that, right? So by allowing a yield after 120 seconds at a red signal, we are simply giving cyclists the power to safely proceed when our infrastructure is not working for them in the way that it should. I passed out a document that I'd all like you to review too at your leisure. And this is an Excel spreadsheet of states that have adopted versions of either the Idaho stop or dead red. And you can see dead red, for instance, Oregon, Washington, Utah, Minnesota, Arizona, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Missouri, Nevada, South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, Wisconsin, all have versions of dead red. So this is not a new concept by any means of the imagination. Next slide.
Actually, before we
Go
move
ahead,
on,
Anna.
I'll just add, so one example of a dead red, I can say, sorry, I keep doing that. The intersection of Northern Lights in Wisconsin in my neighborhood. So when I commute by bike, I'm going north, trying to get into the neighborhood. And of course, Northern Lights is a bigger street than Wisconsin, but it's still a pretty major intersection. And if there is not a car who triggers the side that I'm on to turn left or right, it doesn't go. And so there's many times that I've sat there. And so that's just one example. I know there's other intersections like that, and bikers would know where those are. And so your question is, do I get out of the road that I was biking in and go over to the sidewalk? Do I wait? Do I just go unsafely through Northern Lights and guess? So, I mean, it is a dilemma. And so then I'm worried if am I going to get a ticket after I've sat there for 2 light cycles? Anyway, just that's an example of what that actually looks like and what it means.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for that. So another bike-friendly behavior is our 3-foot passing law, rules for overtaking on the left. And so the rule is that the driver of a motor vehicle overtaking a vulnerable road user proceeding in the same direction shall pass to the left at a safe distance, not less than 3 feet. We're all familiar with this, right? Social distancing. We want social distancing between our vehicles and our cyclist. And so what our ordinance provides for is not a requirement, but an encouragement that municipal traffic engineer may erect and maintain signage along public ways to notify operators of motor vehicles of that requirement. And it's great that our municipal code has this progressive requirement. And many cities and states are actually fighting right now to implement similar laws. However, where we fall a little bit flat is that no one knows about it. Massachusetts recently passed this kind of legislation, but they required the accompanying signage so that drivers are actually aware of this. Colorado, California, and Florida are all other examples where they included signage in their legislation. Okay, next slide. So who yields to whom? There is a hierarchy, right? When if we're going to do an Idaho stop, really we have to consider sort of priority of vulnerability, and I would also suggest speed. Wherever there is doubt or ambiguity, travelers shall yield the right of way to the more vulnerable road user. So someone driving a motor vehicle needs to yield to people on bicycles and other non-motorized traffic. And in turn, those vulnerable road users who are moving a little bit faster should yield to pedestrians, people walking and using wheelchairs. And just so I'm clear on this and other folks are clear, in our current code, pedestrian is an inclusive term that includes people afoot, persons afoot, and also folks in wheelchairs. Okay, so if you're coming up and you're slowing at the Idaho stop, you still need to watch if a pedestrian or a wheelchair user is going across the street and yield to them. Next slide, please. So bike lanes and who can use them. Next slide. This is kind of our next category. So first, some definitions. We have bicycle lanes. Bicycle lanes in our ordinance are sort of the umbrella, okay? And what are bicycle lanes? We amend the definition of bicycle lanes so that it's a portion of a roadway designated by pavement markings and, if used, signs for preferential or exclusive use by not just bicyclists, but vulnerable road users. So that's a deletion of bicyclist and an insertion of vulnerable road users in its place in that definition. And I want to talk a little bit about why we think it's important to allow some of the other user groups in bicycle lanes. One of the major pieces of pushback surrounding implementation of bicycle lanes is that they are an exclusive use lane. High-ranking transportation decision makers have often echoed this sentiment, noting that even car lanes allow tractors and bikes and buses. Mobility is a broad spectrum, and limiting use of the public way to certain devices is difficult to do and is not future-proof. So perhaps there's a good argument to be made that bike lanes are not very accessible depending on who we allow to operate in them. So this draft revision allows any vulnerable road user other than someone walking to be in a bike lane, other than a person afoot, which to me sounds like something out of The Hobbit, but it is what it is. Okay, next slide. So within the umbrella of bike lanes, here's our first definition. This is not currently defined in code, a protected bicycle lane. So what is a protected bicycle lane? A bicycle lane physically guarded from vehicle traffic with a barrier such as bollards, medians, and raised curbs. Another interesting part of this legislation that was very important to me is that we include under that definition that bike lanes can be seasonal or temporary. And you can use temporary barriers like planters, landscaping, Trees and fish totes. How Alaskan is that, right? Removable bollards. And the reason for that is I think we have pursuing the future of active transportation, we have an opportunity to be really innovative as a winter city. One of the feedbacks that I hear sometimes when I'm like preaching the protected bike lane gospel is, oh, that'll never work here because it snows. Well, what if we had summer bike lanes, right? I think that could work and that could be really great. And a lot of people would love to commute during the summer on their bike and make that mode shift. Another interesting thing that I think that we could ponder in the future is right now, we all know we have a huge issue. Look at what happened this winter when the plows come through and where does the snow go? On the sidewalk. Well, what if in the winter, when the bike lane is deactivated, that's where the snow goes? Keeping our sidewalks clear and passable for vulnerable road users, right? Interesting to think about. So we put that in there. Next slide. Really important when we're talking about bike lanes to make sure we're all speaking the same language. And there's some confusing terms that seem sometimes to cross over, right? What is a buffered bike lane? Well, you might think, okay, a physical buffer. Well, no. A buffered bike lane, which is defined in code in our ordinance, not currently defined, but our ordinance defines it. This is from the AMAT's non-motorized plan. And so we're going to make sure that we're being consistent with other municipal documents. A buffered bicycle lane is a bicycle lane paired with designated buffer space that uses pavement markings, but no physical barriers. So you can see in the photo there that the paint on the ground there is really what's separating. It's a visual buffer. And then next slide, sort of the third definition under that umbrella of bike lanes is a cycle track. This is something that's, it's a term that's not really widely known yet by people outside of transportation nerdiness. But a cycle track is a permanently installed on-street protected bike lane, physically separated from motor vehicle travel. They can be one-way or two-way. They can be at street level, at sidewalk level, or at an intermediate level. But very importantly, they are meant to provide a high level of security and comfort for vulnerable road users. And in some cities, these cycle tracks are actually signalized. They have their own special traffic lights with special bike signal lights. And so that's something that we lay out in the ordinance too, as a framework for signalized, or essentially for bike signals. Next slide. So this is just a fun little graphic that Matthew and Ali helped put together about, okay, who is allowed where in code, right? So we'll start on the right side because I think that's going to be interesting. Who's allowed in the roadway in current code and under our ordinance? And I want to point out that this would be a roadway where there is a sidewalk. In Anchorage Code 92080, walking on the roadway, where sidewalks are provided, it is unlawful for any pedestrian to walk along or upon the adjacent roadway. However, where sidewalks are not provided, any pedestrian walking along and upon a street shall, when practicable, walk only on the left side of the roadway. So essentially, if there's no sidewalk, you can be in the roadway if you're on a person on foot or in a wheelchair. But if there is a sidewalk, you should be going to the left side of the graphic there and you should be on the sidewalk. And then most importantly, what our ordinance is really meant to address is who is allowed to be in the bicycle lane. And you can see, this might be surprising to some folks, but this is meant to be very inclusive, that any vulnerable road user other than a pedestrian can be in the bicycle lane, making it a less of an exclusive use. And I would argue safer for all users. To have those folks separated from vehicle traffic makes drivers of vehicles safer. It also makes those vulnerable road users more safe. Anything you want to add, Karen or Anna? Cool. Next slide. Okay. So I think probably this next category is going to be the most controversial portion of this ordinance, and that's our goal of increasing safety with the right-sized enforcement. Nationally, traffic laws are disproportionately enforced against Black, Latinx and low-income people on bikes, especially where infrastructure is lacking. And so there's been a couple national reports, Arrested Mobility, NACTO is breaking the cycle, that lay out that case very well with the data. And I want to be very clear. I know we have Chief Curl, I think it was in the room, maybe he's gone now, but this should not be considered in any way an indictment of current APD practices, but rather preventative medicine as Anchorage moves in the direction of active transportation based on what we see in national data. 2 questions for framing as we enter this conversation. When it comes to certain bicycle protective equipment, number 1, is this a best practice that should simply be encouraged, or something that should result in a potential encounter with law enforcement and penalization? Number 2, is this worth APD's time to prioritize or enforce when there are more pressing public safety matters they need to be able to respond to? So those are kind of my 2 main overarching questions. Next slide. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this just because I think it's important. One of the things that our ordinance does is it removes the requirement to have a helmet, to wear a helmet if you're a cyclist. And I know that is maybe surprising to folks. Why? Helmets are really good. Helmets prevent traumatic brain injury. Helmets help keep kids safe. So neither myself nor my co-sponsors want to in any way diminish the importance of wearing a helmet. However, we want to talk again about that framing of, should a kid riding a bike have an encounter with a cop that potentially could go negative for not wearing a helmet when they're riding their bike in their neighborhood? So I want to talk about an article. It's a New York Times article. The title is "Seattle Bike Helmet Rule is Dropped Amid Racial Justice Concerns." And I hope you all will indulge me. I'm going to read a little bit from the article just because I think it lays out the argument really well. So this article is from February of 2022. The King County Board of Health voted to repeal the requirement on Thursday, with only 1 member opposing the decision. The question before us yesterday wasn't the efficacy of helmets, said Germain Zahile, a board member who is also a member of the King County Council. The question before us is whether a helmet law that is enforced by police on balance produces results that outweigh the harm that the law creates. We have to have a broad view of public health. Yes, we have to think about brain injury, and we also have to think about the impact on our criminal legal system, Mr. Zahile said. The Board of Health, made up of elected officials and appointed medical experts from across the country, began to scrutinize the helmet rule in 2020 after an analysis of court records from Crosscut, a local news site, showed that it was rarely enforced and enforced disproportionately when it was. Since 2017, Seattle police had given just 117 helmet citations, over 40% of which went to people who were homeless. Since 2019, 60% of citations went to people who were homeless. A separate analysis from Central Seattle Greenways, a Safe Streets advocacy group, found that Black cyclists were almost 4 times as likely to receive a citation for violating the helmet requirement as a white cyclist. Native American cyclists were just over twice as likely to receive one as white cyclists. Neither study looked at whether homeless people or people of color wore helmets less frequently than other groups, but the Central Seattle Greenway study did look at racial demographics of cyclists and found that people of color were less likely to ride bikes than white people. It was a law that really allowed the police department, the Seattle Police Department, to harass Black and brown community members, said K.L. Shannon, an organizer for Seattle Neighborhood Greenways and Police Accountability Chair for the Seattle King County chapter of the NAACP. Ms. Shannon's nephew, so she's got a personal story here. Ms. Shannon's nephew was just 8 years old when he and 3 friends were stopped by an officer a few blocks from their houses for not wearing helmets. She said, Ms. Shannon said that the officer accused them of stealing the bikes. Until this day, my nephew doesn't ride a bike, Ms. Shannon. He's never forgotten that. Finally, let's see. Across the country, other kinds of biking regulations have been found to be enforced in discriminatory ways. In Chicago, a study found that tickets were issued to cyclists 8 times more often in majority Black parts of the city. An investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice found that 73% of bicycle stops in Tampa, Florida between 2014 and 2015 involved Black cyclists, despite the fact that Black people made up 26% of the population. The data revealed that stops did not reduce crime or produce any other positive outcome, such as reducing bike crashes or injuries, the report said. And I like this last quote. This is by Bill Nesper, director of the League of American Bicyclists. The best investments to keep people safe while riding bikes is creating safe streets, safer transportation systems. Those are the types of investments that are going to keep people walking and biking safest in our communities, instead of investing in laws that could be a barrier to people riding bikes and that may be enforced in discretionary and in discriminatory ways. So thank you. I know that was kind of long, but I just think that really gets to the heart of our why as co-sponsors. Why are we doing this? Anything that you wanted to add, Anna or Karen? Go ahead, Karen.
So Chief Curl actually gave me the statistics for pedestrian and bike citations for the last 5 years. And it, as Mr. Boland said earlier, it's, it doesn't seem to be a problem in our community, but it just eliminates the possibility of that. So like, for instance, one year, I think there were 8 bike citations, and the first year of bike light requirement, I think there were 42, but it's a fairly small number of people who are being cited on bikes. The other thing, I taught elementary health, and I liked having a bike helmet law. And the kids would always ask me, do you actually get tickets? And, they knew that they'd never heard of anyone getting a ticket. So, I would like to have kids feel like they had to wear a helmet, but I totally understand what we're doing here. So.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's setting the stage for a future of active transportation. Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, sorry to jump in. Yeah, I think because I think the one way to look at it is how do we get safe behaviors that we want? I think Daniel made this point already. It's not always giving people tickets for doing that. I mean, one, we know our police are understaffed already. We know that these aren't being enforced, and we know that in other places they can be misused, or they can have a disproportionate and discriminatory impact. So the question is not so much, these are in our laws now. It's more like, we're not using them anyway. Are they doing what they're supposed to? Why don't we just take them out? And then the other question again is to go back to this point, like, do we really want 8-year-olds getting tickets? And I would think the answer is no. I mean, we're not talking about criminal behavior. We're not talking about something that harms somebody else. We're talking about something where it's, not the best choice, but there's plenty of things that we don't, we're eating cookies for breakfast. Maybe that's not the best choice. Doesn't mean that we should have the police giving out tickets for that. So I would just encourage folks. It is a mind shift to think about, enforcing things less or not using enforcement as the main tool. But I think it is a valid thing. And I think a lot of our safety issues are design issues, they're road issues. And there's also behaviors and norms, like how fast people go on the trails, things like that. So I think we can't solve everything by giving people tickets. So we want to think about how to do that differently.
Anna made me think about, I know that, I'm not sure if it's happening this summer, but I know previous summers, police officers were actually giving out little incentives to kids they saw with helmets. I think that's a much better way to go at solving the problem.
Yeah, I love that. And just think what that would do for a kid's confidence to have that positive interaction and that kind of a reward for great behavior. That's a great point. Okay, next slide. We also, in our decriminalizing bike riding, which I think is maybe a little over the top title, but that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make it accessible. We do remove some other fines as well. So carrying articles on a bike without one hand on the handlebars, riding without a lamp, riding without a bell, riding without brakes. I'm going to skip the next one and come back to it. And then not wearing a helmet, right? And so our argument is that protective equipment can absolutely prevent injuries, but it has also proven to be a barrier to getting people on bikes. And national data demonstrates enforcement inequity. So while it is a best practice, and I want to reiterate that, to always ride with a bell, lights, and a helmet, ultimately riding without those things won't likely cause a cyclist to hurt somebody else. Additionally, by creating such additional requirements for equipment, the municipality is creating a higher barrier to entry for children of low-income families. This barrier, combined with the potential for these strictly technical provisions of code to be disproportionately, the potential, we're not saying that it is, but the potential for these technical provisions of code to be disproportionately enforced against people of color, as discussed above, can create an equitable result in who can take full advantage of the bicycling opportunities that Anchorage has to offer. On a quick note, the one that I said I would come back to, altering a serial number or registration, that has, there was in 2019, Member Constant sponsored an ordinance because of the bike theft issue here in Anchorage. That was moved into Title 8 as a misdemeanor, and that's where I think it should remain. So it should remain there, and we should remove it from the table in Title 9. Great.
Can I have one quick,
Go ahead.
or two things quick? One, I just noticed there's a typo, riding without brakes. That's supposed to be brakes as in stopping equipment, not that we're ticketing people for not taking breaks on their bikes.
Right.
So that it's correct in the ordinance. We just,
B-R-A-K-S, yes.
but also just again, to emphasize on the enforcement point, it made me think of the bicycle advocacy community for years has talked about, and I might be wrong on this, but there's 3 E's, maybe there's 4 E's now, but one of the E's is enforcement. The other one is encouragement, and then one is education. So I think, again, we want to think about where we can encourage people, like the incentive for kids having helmets, and where we can educate people on the laws. And that could be signage, it can be programs, whatever it is. So I think, again, we want to think about how do we create a safe community, and we have multiple tools in that toolbox.
Okay, and then next item, we're almost getting through this, guys. So our S version, this is something we kind of wanted to test the waters here and maybe see what members thought about this. And this is actually something that was recommended that we look at by Mr. Coy. If you go to the next slide, the S version additionally decriminalizes jaywalking. So it allows pedestrians to cross the street within 150 feet of a red light as long as it's safe. Why do people jaywalk? Well, all kinds of reasons. To catch a bus, time crossing with a signal change, because the coast is clear and there's no present danger, or simply because it's more convenient. And then on our final slide, further reading, again, some of the information that informed this legislation, our Vision Zero plan, which we are far off from accomplishing its goals, I would say. The AMAT's non-motorized plan, breaking the cycle, which is that NACTO report, arrested mobility. And then I'd like to add CalBike, they have a Freedom to Walk campaign they did, and I'll give you guys the website. It's CalBike, CalBike.org/freedom-to-walk-campaign/. And that talks a lot about the history of the criminalization of jaywalking and essentially why we cede so much space to cars rather than pedestrians. And again, nationally, some inequitable enforcement. And just one last time for the record, I want to say that this legislation is informed mostly by national data. It's not an indictment of APD practices. As Member Bronga said, I don't feel that APD overpenalizes or enforces, or I don't have any evidence that they do that disproportionately. But we're just trying to set the stage for the future. Again, if we create, part of the reasons that we don't have a lot of folks cycling, as many as we could on the roads, not on the trails, but on the roads, is because we don't have safe infrastructure for cyclists. We haven't made those investments. One thing that I'm really excited about is that I've been working with Mr. Coy on a temporary, and Emily as well has been involved in those conversations, a temporary protected bike lane demonstration. It looks like we're going to be able to receive some federal funding and work with some consultants to model what a protected bike lane, a truly physically buffered bike lane could look like in Anchorage. And we've identified a handful of locations as candidates. So stay tuned to that. But I think that's sort of like the first crack in the door for Anchorage to move even more in this direction. And I think at this point, I'll probably turn it back over to the chair. Would love to maybe hear from the other members of the working group and then also have discussion with our colleagues.
Great. So I'll invite folks to get into the queue while our other speakers, if you want to say anything before we get into discussion.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks everybody for being here. Thanks to the sponsors of this ordinance. Like Member Boland said, Bike Anchorage has been involved with this from almost the start, and we're super excited about it. We wholeheartedly support almost everything. I'll get to the almost. But yeah, for all the reasons Member Boland said. So I think in the interest of time, I'll jump to the almost. There's one thing that we would like to see changed, other than decriminalizing jaywalking. We support that as well for the S version. But I wanted to speak about the dead red item where, as drafted, the AO says, if you come up to a stoplight and you wait 120 seconds, then you're legally allowed to proceed if the light hasn't changed or detected you. I've been told, and probably Mr. Coy can validate this, that there's one stoplight in Anchorage that's designed to detect bicycles. The rest are not designed to. Some of them do when I'm on my steel bike. Most of them don't. So right away, coming up to a stoplight, I know, like, I can't count on this turning. It's not going to turn. To expect me to sit there and wait 120 seconds looking at my watch, counting down before I'm legally able to proceed, there's a number of problems with that. One is you're in harm's way, and it feels like you're in harm's way. You're standing in the middle of this busy intersection. It's pretty terrifying. So that becomes a barrier to more people biking, as well as a very real danger. And for people who don't look like me, who might be more vulnerable or feel more vulnerable to enforcement, it's got to be even worse, where they're like, okay, I've got to wait 120 seconds and I've got to stand here in danger versus potentially breaking the law. That's a really tough choice to make. The other reason I would encourage changing that is because waiting 120 seconds doesn't inherently make it safer to cross the intersection. If I can choose my time to cross, I'm going to be super careful. I'm looking, I don't want to get hit by a car. It's better to allow me the freedom to choose when is the safest time to cross versus having to sit there and wait and wait and wait. And then well, okay, I can finally go. I guess I better go as soon as I can. So what several states have done, that's in your table here too. They have decided to treat a stoplight, a red light, like a stop sign for bicyclists. So you come up to the intersection, you've come to a full stop, and then when it's safe, just like a one-way stop sign, you're able to proceed. So Idaho implemented that with their infamous Idaho stop in 1982. It's still implemented, it's been successful. They saw a 14% reduction in collisions involving bicycles when they implemented the Idaho stop, which includes the stop sign as yield, as well as the stop light as stop sign. Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Colorado also have this treat a stoplight as a stop sign. So it's demonstrated, it's successful, it's safer, and I think it's a lot easier to implement and also removes an enforcement burden where, I don't know, probably a police officer doesn't want to stand there watching their stopwatch either for 120 seconds. So there's my pitch on that one. Otherwise, we're super supportive of this. Really appreciate the safety aspects for bicyclists and other vulnerable road users, as well as the equity aspect. So thanks for your consideration.
Thank you. My name is Diana Rhodes with the Anchorage Park Foundation. Assemblymember Brawley invited me up today, super supportive of this ordinance. One of the reasons we support it so much is that active transportation and just giving the definitions and the names is so important to how we look at our infrastructure. We've worked with the Assembly to brand the Moose Loop as our active transportation network. We're able to get it into the AMAT's non-motorized plan. So then you have a way to talk about the existing infrastructure that is safe and talk about connecting safe passages to that safe infrastructure. So that has been something we've been very excited about. And so we serve on a statewide active transportation coalition. It was started by the Department of Health with support from DOT. And we're really taking note of what is happening here at the Anchorage Assembly level and hoping to bring all of this information to this statewide network. And Assemblymember Brawley had invited me, we talked about it, and also Assemblymember Volland about bringing this film. It's the kind of the history of active transportation. It's called the Street Project, and it's going to be, we have a number of organizations, Muni's Department of Health, Bike Anchorage, the Alaska Department of Health, AARP Alaska, and many other partners that are working to bring it here. We'll show it at the library, the LUSAC library, and just hoping people will come out and support your work that you're doing and learn even more about how to make our streets more safe. Thank you.
Hi, Assembly and Council and those. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Brad Coy, the Municipal Traffic Engineer. And I wanted to start by just letting you know a few of the things that we're doing at the Traffic Engineering Department along this line, because a lot of the things we've been talking about fit into it. So first off, I'm really excited to announce that on Monday, we have a new staff person starting. We've re-envisioned our traffic calming position to be a traffic calming pedestrian bicycle coordinator position. And he's actually in the room, Zach Hartman. So we're really excited to having someone focused in on helping to move forward with the engineering and the education and just the program side of what we can do with regards to non-motorized users. So that's something that's really exciting. We also are underway with the pilot project for protected bike lanes. The consultant is under contract with the DOT using their research funds. They are in the process of procuring devices to install a temporary protected bike lane on Pine and McCary streets alongside Russian Jack Park. And so they've got a design that they're working through. We've talked in the Muni about how at different departments, how we're going to do that. So it's looking like August, September, it will go up, is the plan right now. Everything's moving forward. So looks like that's on track. That's phase one. There are 2 other phases that we'll look at. Phase 2 will look at fireweed. That's kind of a separate project. And phase 3 will look at a smaller network, likely in the downtown area next summer. So the consultant team is working through that process. So some exciting things that are happening. So having the definitions and those items in here are valuable. We're also working closely with Parks Foundation and the Parks and Rec Department on bicycle wayfinding for the Moose Loop. So really excited about that. Having a new coordinator, we're effectively starting a bicycle wayfinding program, and so having discussions on that, looking for funding to be able to really up our game here in Anchorage with what the bicycle wayfinding looks like. And there are a few studies that are coming up, downtown engineering street study, looking at how to change the downtown for multimodal, and also the right-of-way management study, looking at how to design our system better so that we can have easier maintenance and better conditions for winter cycling. I do spend my time cycling around Anchorage. I've actually started tracking like how many streets in Anchorage I've cycled, which is now into the 13%, which is about 350 miles out of about 2,600 miles. Anyway, so if you look at my map, you can follow me and wander around. I'm happy to share it with you. You can see everywhere that I've cycled around Anchorage. It's been a great way to see all these conditions. And so I have, with that experience and also talking with my staff, there are a few things that we want to point out with this ordinance that both we're supportive of or okay with, not objecting to, but also a few things that we do have some current concerns about. Is now a good time to go through those items? So a few of those, I did send an email a few hours ago looking at a few of them. So looking at kind of the page one, there are a few whereas statements where it talks about 14% of South Central Alaskans bike or walk, and 16% bike or walk to school or work. I did talk with those that did that survey, and I have some updated numbers that are Anchorage specific. There were about 440 respondents in that survey that were from Anchorage zip codes. And those numbers actually for the respondents are more like 22% for both of those. The one thing that I want to point out though is this was not a random sample. This was not the sort of outreach or the sort of effort you would expect to be able to have a conclusive number. And so I would encourage that whereas be clear that this isn't saying this is how many do it, but this is how many of the respondents of the survey did it. And I can provide you the information so that you could increase that to say, Anchorage respondents if you would like and have the higher number. But that's one of the items. The second item is the next whereas. Looking at that report, the DOT didn't actually estimate what the driving patterns could be replaced. They did have some data. So this is taking the data from DOT and adding a new finding. And so I think it's important to not represent what the DOT's report was saying in this way. Instead, consider how that whereas can be changed because they were not having this finding, if that makes sense. So those are two on the whereas. On some of the definitions, I did in the email that I sent have a few items where there are a few different questions that I ask. I don't know if I want to go into all those details now, unless it's helpful to spend a little bit of time discussion about those.
I briefly read your email
Okay.
this morning. And I think probably like the most substantive thing was your concerns about the dead red
Right.
portion.
So we can jump to the dead red.
And some of it was just other language stuff, which we can totally work on amending.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. So jumping to the dead red question of being able to proceed through a stoplight on red. So the 120 seconds that was in here corresponds a little bit like if you look at the table that Assemblymember Volin provided, where it says one cycle with vehicle detection device. So the 120 seconds is about the length of time that someone would have to wait through a cycle to determine, okay, I was not detected. So that's what that 120 was based off of. In talking with my signal staff and my staff at the department and biking around town, in thinking about having the dead red option, it is something that we have concerns about. In talking with members of the public, there's a lot of misunderstanding or things that are not understood about how our signal system works. And so we have a few lights, Spenard and Benson and Spenard and Northern Lights that do have radar detection for bikes. As projects are coming on board, we are putting up more radar detection. So, how are signals detecting vehicles? If I ask that question, would you know the options for detection and what we do? Probably not, right? So there's loops in the pavement. You can't see them because we don't put them in the pavement. We put them actually in the subbase. So you can't see them, but they detect when a big, heavy metal object passes over them, which does not include bikes, right? So bikes are not getting detected through those loops. And even in some cases, I think motorcycles probably don't, which is why you'll see in some of the other state information that it's not getting detected. So that's one question about detection. How do you know if you're getting detected or not? The second is, how do our signals operate? There's something called pre-timed signals. There's something called actuated signals. There's actuated coordinated, semi-actuated. There's a spectrum, and you can't just go to a signal and know what it's operating at because it actually changes by time of day as well. Sometimes the day it operates some ways and sometimes it doesn't. The flashing don't walk sign across the crosswalks also vary by time of day. So there's a lot of things going on. The system's fairly complex. And And sometimes, and so as we look at where the signals are located, they are often in higher volume, higher speed, busier locations, sometimes limited sight distance. There's a few different elements that go into where a traffic signal is put. So as I think about the majority of signals around Anchorage, being able to allow a cyclist to stop and proceed through, there's definitely anxiety or concern about the wisdom of doing that. And the solution right now for many of those locations is you proceed to the corner where there's a push button for pedestrians and you cross the crosswalk. So that is the alternative to sitting and waiting in traffic. And as our staff do spend time looking at video footage of what's going on around Anchorage, some of the crashes and things that are happening on our intersections, the signalized intersections that involve cyclists, are often either flagrant or flukes. So it didn't appear to us that looking at this that this solution would encourage a lot more additional cycling or benefit in that way. So those are some of our thoughts, and so at this point, our preference is we are doing work to look at the bicycle detection and getting increased detection into our system. So that's the approach that we would prefer to go with regards to the signalized locations. When it comes to the stop signs, having it be more a yield sign, many of the stop signs are in residential, low volume locations. We don't have the same safety concerns about those ones, but the signals, thinking about where they are, I can't think of very many signals around Anchorage where I would support doing the dead red, if that makes sense. There might be a few, but all in all, there is so much going on, and it's complex enough that from our perspective on the safety standpoint. Do you have any questions?
No, I think it's always good to have multiple perspectives in the room. It's interesting because those signal upgrades are very expensive and they take a lot of time and they're programmed out years in advance. And so if we had that radar detection today, we wouldn't need this legislation. But what is the current condition today? Not to get too much into debate, because it's a work session, I certainly appreciate the traffic directors, the traffic department's position on this. But I guess just again, a way to frame it is what's already happening. What are bicyclists already doing because the infrastructure is not designed for them? Again, I think there's big challenges with requiring them to have to go to the side of a street, press the button, get in the crosswalk. What if you're on a street that has a series of signals? You got to do that every time. And I don't know. I think the goals of the ordinance to make it easier to lower those barriers to active transportation. In my perfect world, and in 20 years, Anchorage will have a high safety, high comfort bicycle network that connects our streets and our trails, and that you can have the same type of safe experience riding on our street as you could have on the Chester Creek Trail, a multi-use path. And we would have signals in a signalized cycle track where you have your own light signal that not only is detecting you, but telling you as a cyclist when to go, when to stop. We're just not there yet. And I think there's going to be maybe some growing pains as we work to move in that direction, and to create in Anchorage that transportation choice that I was talking about. That's my vision for the city. But certainly appreciate the concerns you're bringing forward.
Yeah, thanks. So a few other of the key items. There's some language about item 9.38.020 C1 bicycle crossing a crosswalk at 10 miles per hour. I don't know if the S version adjusts this, but it did talk about where a motor vehicle is approaching the crosswalk was verbiage that had been included. So given that 10 miles an hour makes sense to slow down to as you cross a driveway or intersection when there's a vehicle there, I guess, yeah, maybe some of these I'll look at the S version. I'll see if it's included in and incorporate.
Great. And then what I think we should do is, because Matthew, I think, is CC'd on your email, and Matthew helped do a lot of some of the drafting and fine tuning as well. But let's get together and with the co-sponsors before Tuesday and maybe move some of Brad's ideas as an amendment as well. That could be helpful. Not all of them, the ones that we agree on. Go ahead.
Okay.
Well, I had a question for Mr. Yeah, one thing I did want to touch on, so I'm looking at your email, your last point. I think it's worth bringing up briefly. You mentioned the rules that are still applied to bicycle rentals versus individuals. So I thought that might be worth a comment. Was that a question or did you have opposition?
That's true. That is one of the big ones too. It looks like it was requiring helmets to be required to be included with bike rentals. And the question there is bike share. If you've traveled to other parts of the country, then having a bike share program, would you always just include a helmet with it becomes a little problematic if you think of the bike share aspect of that. And then the other part of the rentals was the light requirements. And I know that there are places that do mountain bike rentals for our amazing single track trails. And would some of these ordinances just inadvertently require them to outfit their bikes with some of these devices? So did that address kind of the...
Well, and I had a follow-up question. Do you know what the typical range for the cost of one light? I mean, I guess how much of a financial burden do you perceive that it would be to require this?
So the light that I have that I use, I bike all year and includes the dark, was only about $30. So not too expensive. I'm sure with a rental bike, you would want something, what I've seen with some of those, especially like a bike share, makes complete sense with bike share to have the light built into the bike and actually powered by the pedaling is what I've seen. And that works well. I don't know what the expense of something like that, but you would want it to be robust enough. So, but I think in that case, that's already included when it comes to bike rentals through a bike shop for those riding the coastal trail during the summer. That probably doesn't make sense to have to outfit it with a light given our summers. So that might be a question there. And that's the other time I've seen a lot of the bike rentals.
So I wrote back a much longer written response. So I feel like we should require these for businesses. I think it's a valid business expense. And I mean, I don't need to go into all of the detail, but essentially the assumption with a bike rental place is that someone who doesn't necessarily live here and they don't own a bike, and so they're not as familiar with our trails. They would certainly be riding in the dark if it's starting in August or fall. We're having a bigger fall. So I guess I'm just going to say my strong preference is to require those things because I don't see it as a big burden. And I think that for liability reasons, it would be appropriate, but I'm also open to discussion later. So just to say, but I appreciate you bringing up that point.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Great, thanks. Before I open it up to other members, Ms. Bronga, did you have anything before we get going? Okay, all right, so I have a few folks in the queue. I have Mr. Soltz, myself, Mr. Martinez, Mr. Gates, and Mr. Cross. Go ahead, Mr. Soltz.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. So I like the idea, people live on Hillside, and one of the big reasons left Hillside was the lack of sidewalks. And we're really down, they have these things called sidewalks, great. Really like seeing the O'Malley project that's putting sidewalks up and down O'Malley. Recently went to Annapolis where it was sort of taking your life in your own hands. If you wanted to bike, where you had bike lanes that appeared and then disappeared, and very narrow streets. want to make sure that we avoid is in a way empowering cyclists or making situations where they apply the laws that they feel suit them. And that's where, you're on a road, if you're following the street laws, you get to a red light and you decide, well, now I'm pedestrian, I'm gonna take the crosswalk and speed up my journey. And the reason is, we have some states where a pedestrian can cross the street and they have the right of way, which is great, but I'm pretty sure that anytime there's a pedestrian or bicyclist car incident, the car will win. So I just want to make sure that as we go down this path, that the pedestrian or cyclists always know that it's their responsibility as well to ensure that they don't, we're talking about crossing through red lights and so forth, have their head on a swivel and are making a decision, again, because the consequence for them is severe. For the motorist, probably not as severe, at least physically. So just want to make sure that point stays with us as we go through this. But I think it's a good piece of work. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I have myself next. Thanks for this presentation, very helpful. I guess I'll just do one question for now, which is around the communications. So I really liked the Oregon education piece that was done. Does this ordinance consider education as a necessary component, and or have the sponsors thought about that? And then I guess conversely, has the traffic department thought about that?
I would say the ordinance itself does not address that, but it definitely is something that we are contemplating. And we even talked about at one point, well, okay, if we're going to remove the helmet requirement, how maybe the assembly can fund helmet education or giving helmets out. And also, we've talked about with our legislative services team about doing a press release and getting some of this messaging out there. But I think it'd be great to maybe work with the traffic department on some videos or something. I love that idea.
Other sponsors want to add?
Yeah, I think just briefly, I think another kind of set of issues that isn't in this ordinance but has come up generally is safety, etiquette, behaviors on our trails. So obviously this is all talking about our roads. And I think that is also a big area of education. I mean, for years, people have talked about speeding on the trails, not being aware, off-leash dogs, like all these kind of issues, especially in high traffic areas, like the coastal trail right next to downtown. So I think if we do discussion about education and encouragement, I think we should broaden that to talk about trails and work with the Parks Department, Park Foundation. But I think that is a big area that our community has needed for a long time.
I can't remember the name of it, but there's a contest at schools to create public safety messages, video messages. So it'd be kind of cool to get this done by schools if possible. The other thing I was just thinking of, I'll come back to it. It just bounced away. So it was something to do with, it might be reeling back a little bit, but I was thinking a little bit more about the horse. And if pedestrians aren't in the protected bike lane because they move slower, like horses are walking. I don't know. We might want to think about that a little bit. It just struck me as I was looking at this.
Can I respond to that, Mr. Chair?
Sure.
It's interesting. So person riding or leading an animal is the language. And I think leading an animal, like if you're walking your dog on a leash, I think you can infer that you'd have to be on the sidewalk because you're still a person afoot. Whereas if you're riding a horse, well, technically, in our current ordinance, you could be in the protected bike lane. And I guess, my question when I contemplate that is, well, where should the horse go? Should it be in the roadway instead of the bike lane? Should it be on the sidewalk? I don't know. Randy, you're going to have to talk to some of your horse people down there in South Anchorage and see what they think maybe.
I thought about it. So the other thing is the education piece. Probably we would have to look at the State of Alaska Driver's Handbook that making sure that any new changes in this are reflected. If it affected a driver's responsibility, then, I think someone actually emailed me about that, like maybe the 3 foot. I don't even know if the state of Alaska driver's handbook says they have to be 3 feet away, a car 3 feet away from a pedestrian, but no one seems to know that. So signage, I think, would also be very important. That's it. Thanks.
Great, wonderful. All right, next I have Mr. Martinez.
All right, I'll get to a question. I have a few points to just kind of, they may be questions for you all to take, not necessarily to respond now to. I see 3 different categories of activity here. I see infrastructure conversation, I see culture conversation and education, and I also see code changes. And there's a sequence to some of these things that we're hoping for, like with respect to code changes that help to promote better culture. And that may not necessarily be, that may be a chicken and egg thing. So education was going to be one of my issues to raise. Are there differences between city and state roads and the rules of crossing them or interacting with them? Next question, just for education and for the public engagement. I'm interested in understanding potentially the question of what is our current maintenance costs and for some of the conditions that were identified as problematic today that would be potentially rectified by this ordinance, like maintenance of the corners where buttons are. What do we spend today? Is there a more money that we need to be spending on those? Because one of the concerns I have is to make sure that we utilize what we have as best as we can while we're making changes that don't necessarily preclude elimination of those requirements and responsibilities today. So even with protected bike lanes and improving definitions, I still want maintenance on those corners for the lights, right? So I don't want to either or those sorts of things, and I just put that out there. And also flashed kind of what governs the speeds on e-bikes. What is our overarching rules that govern e-bike speeds? And this doesn't necessarily codify it in here, but I just flagged that as concerns with respect to the equity questions of active transportation and the different speeds that people move. And the last point I'll raise is I think the equity questions are really important. The preventative medicine, I think, rings true to me in a lot of ways, but I also recognize that there are not people of color here talking about the equity question. And if there had been, or if there are communications from folks, I think their vantage point would be helpful. Thank you.
Can I address the last part? So thank you for that. That was sort of one of the things that was important to me is, we have 3 white co-sponsors of this, and I will acknowledge that. And, nothing about us without us. So we definitely tried. One of the things that Anna worked with Jennifer to put together is a memo kind of outlining our public process and which groups that we sent this to. We did ask the Equity Committee of the Assembly to review it, and they did. And then we also sent it to the Alaska Black Caucus, and I believe that they're going to be providing some testimony and weighing in on our at our meeting on Tuesday. And so, yeah, I think we actively sought feedback on that stuff, and that was really important to me. On the e-bike thing, there is a definition of e-bikes in our code, and it says that they are defined 20 miles per hour or less. Certainly there are e-bikes in the world that go faster than that. There's also, Segway makes e-kick scooters that can go 60 miles an hour. One wheels can go that fast. And so that's something that's interesting to think about how technology is emerging. And as people switch from vehicles to more vulnerable methods of transportation, I think that speed consideration is very important. And for me, I will say one of the things that we are contemplating maybe as co-sponsors is an amendment to have a speed limit on trails. Because I don't think in existing code, and Brad could correct me maybe, but I don't think that we actually have a speed limit on our multi-use pathways. At least I've never seen them posted. And because for me, I think there's a little bit of fear about e-bikes, but I think you can go just as fast, or you can approach dangerous speeds, I should say, on an acoustic bike as you can on an electric bike. That's what I'm calling them now, acoustic bikes. And for me, I was on the coastal trail now the other day, and I was riding my friend's e-bike, which is the class that you can control without pedaling. You can just do a throttle. And I felt, yeah, class one, Kevin says, who is an e-bike enthusiast. I felt like I was going at a reasonable speed. And then I had this guy behind me trying to draft off me on an acoustic bike in his Lycra shorts on this road bike, making me uncomfortable because he's so close behind me. And I already feel like I'm going fast enough. It's like, dude, go around me. And so I think just to single out one vulnerable road user as like the offender is not fair. But I think, this ordinance is sort of about deregulating, decriminalizing, but speed, I think, is a factor no matter the method of transportation where you are making other people unsafe if you're going at a speed that is not appropriate for the environment. So definitely appreciate you bringing that up. I'm also curious about I would like to maybe hear from Brad about your first question about muni roads versus state roads. I think that's interesting.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to flag the Chief Equity Officer would be welcome to comment on these things as well.
Yeah, so my question would be for Police Chief Curl on that, because I believe, correct, that Title IX is involving our traffic enforcement, and we enforce all of Anchorage, right? State, city, we do everything for all roads. We don't differentiate between this is a state road versus a city road. So I'm pretty sure that it applies to all when it comes to the enforcement side.
There are some state roads that prohibit chief things. This is Chief Carroll through the chair. There are some state roads that prohibit traffic. If you get on the Glen Highway going outbound, you'll see it says only vehicles are allowed there. No horseback, no bicycles, no anything. So there are state roads that prohibit that.
And then speaking of the maintenance, if any push button is covered by snowbanks and it comes to our attention, we do coordinate with the snow removal team to get them cleared as soon as possible. And as you were aware this last winter, there were times when, as plowing was occurring, that there were banks that built up near poles, but in my observations, they were addressed. The snow maintenance crews know that they need to keep the push buttons clear. So besides the kind of immediately following a snowstorm when things are still in the works for the duration of winter, it's my understanding that they are kept clear. The push buttons are.
Great, thanks. Just want to note we have a little bit less than 10 minutes left. We have 3 folks left in the queue. Start with Mr. Gates.
Never mind. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. Mr. Cross?
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to have this conversation. Having been born and raised in this town and grew up a voracious little bicyclist that I was on my Red Line Carrera, doing my sweet BMX tricks up on the hillside, I've been hit 3 times by cars in this town. I was coming down Huffman Hill. I was riding my bike right in front of Huffman Elementary School, and a big truck with the extended mirrors hit me in the back of the head and sent me over my handlebars in the ditch, and it peeled all the skin off the back of my legs as I slid across the pavement. He was nice enough to slow down for about half a second before he sped up and drove away. The other 2 instances were very similar, and this is something that's always concerned me, is that, there's just a lack of awareness of bicycles because they go so long during the winter. They acclimate to not having to look for it. And the big issue that I have is where we have the bicycle trails on the side of a one-way street, and people exiting only look the direction of traffic, and they blow past this. They California roll, or whatever you want to call it, when they stop and they don't look, and you're like, wait a second. And you as a bicyclist, you're like, hey, do you make eye contact with me? And their head's turning and they blow right through. The worst one is in front of Costco on Diamond, where you've got a bike trail right there. That's one way. There's a median. They never look that way, but that's a very active bike trail that feeds there. I went over a hood on that one, and then the other one was over on Lake Otis near the Lake Otis and Tudor. Same situation, riding down the side of the road. Someone turned in, didn't bother to look to see somebody was in the bike lane, turned right in front of me, side swipe, go over the hood. So it's a very, very dangerous town. And I like a lot what's in this. I'm concerned about I've always concerned about the helmet issue. We don't require helmets on motorcycles, but I think I think there should be a good emphasis on minors. They don't have a choice. They should have good instruction to make sure. I think once you go over to 18, your choice, whether or not you want a helmet, I would highly encourage it because of the drivers in this town, but it's also, you have the right to make stupid decisions. So whether or not you wear a helmet, I think falls in line with, like, it should stay consistent with motorcycles. As far as the lights on bikes, I think that you should just require, part of that is that I would be curious what the insurance requirement is for someone who's renting bikes, and if the insurance requires that they have some sort of minimal safety equipment, unless it's for downhill, but maybe they have the option to provide it and say, hey, listen, here's a lamp, it's a clamp on or whatever, we encourage you to do it. But if you're rallying down the blueberry trails or you're hitting any of the hillside, you're not going to want, the stuff's going to fall off the first hit you hit, the stuff, anything that clamps on and stuff, or it doesn't function very well. So curious about how some of those mandates work. And the last thing is, I just want to make sure we understand that, e-bikes, I got 3 of them. I love them. As an old guy who's spent his years riding motorcycles and's got one bad knee and another one on its way, e-bikes are the way you get back out on the trails and experience some of that youthful exuberance without being in pain for the next 2 days. So for me, it's I'm not in a mobility scooter yet, but I've gotten so I think a lot of that is just understanding that I anticipate. In fact, there was just an article with ADN about how that's increasing, that since our average age of individuals is increasing, that this is going to be an industry that's going to continue to grow. And I think that the e-bike to me is what the 12 speed was to the single speed. And that there was, when they first came out, and I remember when we had the first specialized stump jumper, which was one of the first mountain bikes, and people were like, oh, you got gears, you're cheating, right? And there was these, I got my single speed, I'm hardcore. And then they get smoke going up the hill because you can granny gear it, right? I see e-bikes is going to move towards that, to where probably in 10 years, it'll be primarily most of the bikes on there. And there'll be those hardcore guys in their Lycra with their huge quads that are just going to be, what do you need? You need a battery. Meanwhile, everybody else is like, I'll wait for you wherever we're going. So I think this gets ahead of that, in that understanding that when we have those bike lanes and getting people aware of that, e-bikes also are going to drive it to where people are riding sooner and later in the season, whether it's fat tire and into that. So I think as technology expands, we need to understand that we need to start being we need to start being aware of creating a better environment for bikes, because I think I just think that's going to be the trend. That's what I anticipate. So that's my thoughts on this ordinance. I appreciate all your hard work, Dan. Good work.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And first off, thank you to Member Bowen and the other co-sponsors. I think this is really, by and large, a really well thought out ordinance, and I'm excited to see Anchorage's infrastructure improve to make it a more bike friendly place. So kudos to you guys for that. I will say the one place where I have some concern is in doing away with some of the requirements for things like helmets for kids, brake requirements, lamps, things of that nature. Now, I understand that we've seen instances in other communities where these have been used to target minorities, and it doesn't sound like that's happening in Anchorage. If it was, I think we'd want to have a very serious conversation with Chief Curl about APD's practices. But given that does not seem to be the problem in Anchorage, it leads me to question whether or not, what is the value of requiring some of this equipment, right? We want people to bike more. We also want them to bike safely. And so in my mind, it would make sense for them to have things like functional lights, given the darkness here, and brakes on the bikes, and also for kids to wear helmets. So with that, since we have the chief here, I'd be curious to get your perspective on where and how these ordinances are being enforced, if they are at all, and if you think there's public safety value in sort of retaining these mechanisms for APD.
Through the chair, well, I didn't see this till last night. None of my people were aware that this was coming down, but I did look at it, and I don't mean to be offensive, but I don't see anything in here that increases safety. I really don't. I think the repealing the helmet law is dangerous. You're going to put the police against parents because kids are going to ask the police in schools, do I have to wear a helmet? We're going to say no. And contrary to Ms. Cross, helmets are required for motorcycles for passengers, not for the drivers. And it is 15 and below that requires helmets now. Do we write that citation? No. I've given out personally hundreds of McDonald's free ice cream cones for kids that are wearing the helmets. And when other kids see that, they love that. Would we ever write a ticket for that? The only time we would do that is if members of the assembly had a complaint and said, there's too many kids not wearing helmets, go out there and do something about it. And then we'd go and enforce the law, which usually we prefer just to stop and say, hey, helmets are safety things. I do disagree. I think if we have stop signs and the traffic engineers have said people should stop there, I don't see the difference between a car and a bicyclist for stopping at a stop sign. It's you either need a stop sign for safety reasons or you don't. When you allow people just to make their mind up, because what's going to happen, and with the dead red too, what's going to happen is it's going to get contorted. Like I tell Brad, hey Brad, you can yield to a stop sign, or you can stop at a red light and then after 120 seconds go through it. By the time it gets over here, it's going to be, hey, you don't have to stop at stop signs or red lights anymore. That's how it's going to get spread. And I don't think there's this increase of safety that way. And the other one, this one's kind of piddly. It's to repeal you don't have to have hand on the bicycle. It just doesn't make, we would probably never enforce that, but to tell people, hey, go down the street with both hands with stuff in it, and you kind of riding your bike without a hand on the steering wheel, it seems like that is contrary to safety. And a lot of the other thing, the equipment stuff, we do write, I sent one of the assembly members, we've written 61 tickets. Most of them are for headlight required, audible signal, riding on the sidewalk, bike lamps required. Those are the ones we write things for, and it's because it's at nighttime. You gave some statistics of the pedestrian, the bicycle accidents. The one thing I didn't see in there, I wish someone had asked me to look at every one of those accidents to see if the pedestrian bicyclists were actually at fault. I think the education part is key. But you can say there's a lot of these accidents here, but when you do away with a lot of these laws, like the jaywalking one, it's going to give people, oh, I can jaywalk now. Even though you're just taking out the part that's 150 feet away from the intersection, they're going to say, oh, they did away with jaywalking. It's going to spread. We can jaywalk anytime we want now. And it doesn't increase safety. So I do agree with most of the members that there are some good changes in here. I just don't see where anything in here promotes safety. And that's just my opinion.
Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing anyone else in the queue. With that, thanks everyone. This is going to be item 13A on our agenda on Tuesday. Looking forward to it. Thanks. This work session is adjourned.